start back with some more modern action while I wait for Ixalan to drop out on Magic Online, and trying to play some sweet decks, you know. So this blue-red kind of control-y, kind of combo-y Through the Breach deck has been making some waves on Magic Online. Finished third in a PTQ, and I think that's the best it's done outside of like 5-0ing some leagues and whatnot, and it looks pretty sweet. And yeah, I just thought I would take this thing for a spin. So this is a deck that has existed for a while, and given what the metagame is right now, I think that is why this deck is starting to pop up. So the two biggest decks are Eldrazi Tron and the green-red Scapeshift Primeval Titan deck. And this is a blue control deck that can actually hang with those decks because it's doing something like really powerful. You could try and kill those decks with something like Tasigur, but that's not really going to work out that well when they start playing like 5/5s and 6/6s. So this deck is going way over the top with Emrakul, and the whole point of the deck is to basically just survive until you can piece together Through the Breach Emrakul, and then hopefully that's good enough. There is almost certainly going to be some fail rate involved. There are going to be times when you combo people and they still don't lose. They're going to keep like two big threats in play, and you're just going to lose anyway. So the point of the deck is to try and keep their board relatively clear. Emrakul does do 15 damage, so a lot of the cards in the deck are also trying to help you get in those last few points. Like either it's just lightning bolting your opponent, getting some chip shots in with Snapcaster Mage or Vendilion Click, maybe electrolyzing them. So maybe Emrakul doesn't clean up all their permanents, but at least you're dealing them lethal damage, you know? But if you just get to wipe their board on turn 5, that's also generally going to be pretty good. That's a virtual win. I would hope that you would win the majority of those games if it happens that early, but yeah, the situations I'm talking about where you just can't clean it up are the fairly late game ones. So deck is constructed pretty interestingly. There's an Izzet main deck and 2 Desolate Lighthouses, also the 2 Vendilion Clicks to be able to cycle through dead combo pieces. So if you have like multiple Through the Breaches or multiple Emrakuls, you kind of want to get rid of them and translate those into extra cards. And some of these decks have also been playing like a Sea Beyond, which is a card that I just love. I hold it near and dear to my heart, but unfortunately is not that good. And if you're going to play like a Sea Beyond type thing, I think Izzet is a pretty reasonable choice since it actually has a lot of utility elsewhere. So the blue combo control decks generally have Remand as their 2-mana counterspell. You will typically find that with these decks, you are happier just cycling through your deck, not even necessarily dealing with your opponent's threats outright, just delaying them and providing you with a little bit of velocity. So you delay the game a little bit, hopefully go through your deck a little bit more, find your combo, because you don't actually need to trade 1-for-1 with your opponent's threats. You don't need to kill your opponent's threats. All you need to do is buy time until you can combo your opponent. So in a lot of ways, this is built pretty similarly to Splinter Twin, except Deceiver Exarch Splinter Twin was a much better game plan than Through the Breach Emrakul, both because like it typically killed your opponent. It's weaker to a few extra things, just like any spot removal spell, but Deceiver Exarch could also just pressure your opponent. And granted, not that much, but you know, it ended up being one of the main ways the deck actually won was actually just attacking for 1 with Deceiver Exarch, whereas your Emrakuls and Through the Breaches don't actually do anything in the meantime. So significantly weaker than Splinter Twin, but I think that's okay. That's a fine place to be for Modern, and this deck is not all in on the combo necessarily. You're not trying to like Simian Spirit Guide out the Through the Breaches or anything. So you are very much like this combo control-y deck. So having some things that can interact with your opponent, like these remands, these spell snares. The deck is also playing a pretty hefty amount of cryptic commands. I think 3 is a lot. Unless you're playing like Ancestral Vision, like this is not a card that you see very often in Modern, just because the format is so fast. But cryptic command, especially in the way the format is now, it's a little bit slower. The decks are doing like pretty powerful things, so Cryptic actually, you know, like you live long enough to actually cast a Cryptic Command. So Cryptic Command and Remand are counterspells, but they're also cyclers. Spell Snare is the one card that doesn't actually replace itself. I think The big reason to include Spell Snare is because it helps you recoup tempo. Like, you're trading 1 mana for 2 mana of theirs, which just ends up being very beneficial, especially when you're on the draw. And I think that this deck needs some amount of that capability, and Spell Snare actually provides that. Now, Spell Snare is not particularly well positioned in the format right now. Like, there aren't a lot of targets in Grixis Death Shadow outside of Snapcaster Mage. It is quite good against the Primeval Titan decks because a lot of their ramp spells cost 2 mana, but it's also not great against Eldrazi-tron. So, it's a card that's going to be hit or miss, but I do think is something that you actually need to include in your deck. Main deck Blood Moons. Main deck Ugly White Border Blood Moons. That's okay. I'll live. Blood Moon is just kind of like an additional combo. It's a 1-card combo against a lot of different decks, and you see the 2 main deck and no additional copies in the sideboard, which is kind of weird. But I think it makes sense because you want the Blood Moons as like a game 1 kind of like gotcha card, but you don't necessarily want to board in more copies of the card, especially once your opponent has seen it, because they will likely try and play around it, like they'll fetch up their wastes or whatever other basic lands are in their decks, and then the Blood Moon won't necessarily do that much. So having it in game 1, I think, gives you a little bit more chance to actually get them with it, because I think a lot of people would look at a deck like this and be like, oh, they're definitely bringing in Blood Moon, but you happen to have the main deck, which I think will catch like some amount of people by surprise. Like, I think if they play like Serum Visions and Lightning Bolt and a bunch of basics, like it's pretty clear that they have the capability of main decking Blood Moon, but you might not be willing to like Expedition map for that waste instead of your 3rd Tron piece if you don't know for sure. And then that's the point where Blood Moon can actually get you those free wins. So, in a sense, it's an additional combo that can help you win the game. And again, much like Through the Breach Emrakul, it is not a guarantee. It is not going to outright win you the game, but it is a soft lock in a way, and I think that helps. Like, you have a few of those types of draws together. Like, either you can get a virtual win with Blood Moon, virtual win with Through the Breach, and I think that helps. Whereas if you were just pigeonholed into resolving Through the Breach to win every single game, I think that would be fairly difficult. So I do like the additional copies of Blood Moon, even though they're dead in certain spots. And again, like, this isn't like a normal control deck where, like, yeah, Remand is pretty bad against 1 mana or cheaper spells, in that you're trading down on mana, like in the opposite way that like Spell Snare actually recoups you mana. Remand sometimes is going to lose you mana, and you're going to end up with a lot of these cards, and even things like Izzet Charm, where it's like, man, these cards are like pretty dead in these specific matchups, and that's okay because you're like, not all of your cards matter the same amount, because all you're trying to do is buy time until you can Emrakul your opponent. So you can like mull to 5 either by mulling to 5 or by drawing 2 dead cards and have it all still be fine. But again, you have things like Vendilion Click and Desolate Lighthouse and Izzet Charm that allow you to cycle through these situationally dead cards. So I think that's okay. And again, I do think that like Blood Moon is going to increase your win rate just by the factor that it's there. You know, like if you didn't play any Blood Moons, obviously you couldn't win any free games with Blood Moons, and then you're stuck trying to win the game with Through the Breach Emrakul. And I think having the Blood Moons is going to just increase your win rate, period. There are obviously going to be some games where you can like nickel and dime people with Snapcaster or Vendilion Click. I think that's more likely to happen in blue mirrors or like something like Death Shadow, where maybe they're dealing themselves some damage. So like Bolt Snap Bolt plus a Vendilion Click shot might be enough to actually kill them. And they're going to be trying to disrupt you and keep you off the combo anyway. So again, like having some creatures is like a fine, you know, plan C, I guess. Other than that, Miser's Copy of Peak, I'm down. I don't I don't think that this is necessarily correct, but it could be helpful in some spots. The deck has 24 land, which is pretty high for one of these blue decks, but you're trying to make a land drop all the way up until turn 5, so I think that's legit. And having some extra cantrips wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing. I do think that there's plenty to spend your mana on in the first 3 turns or so between like Spell Snare, Remand, Electrolyze / Vendilion Click, that you don't want to overload your deck on cantrips and be forced to have to like use cantrips to try and find your 3rd land instead of just like keeping up in mana for Remand. Opt might change things in that like Opt plays pretty well with decks that are trying to play at instant speed. And this deck with its Vendilion Clicks, Electrolyzes, Snapcasters, Remands is like mostly trying to do that. So I think Opt could potentially have a home here. I don't know if you cut Opt or you cut Serum Visions for Opt, or if you play both. If you do play both, I don't know if you play 4 Opt, 2 Visions, 4 Visions, 2 Opt. I don't know how many lands you want to cut necessarily, but generally, I think that Serum Visions is significantly stronger than Opt, to the point where you would still want to start with Serum Visions and then add Opts, but I don't know. We'll see. It'll be pretty interesting. As for the mana base, we have 3 Steam Vents, which is a lot. I generally feel like these decks could get away with 2. It is basically whether or not you actually want to draw a Steam Vents, because you should never need more than 2 copies to fetch for. So I feel like this is saying like, hey, I don't mind having a Steam Vents in my opening hand, as opposed to like having the 4 Sulfur Falls where for each Sulfur Falls there's diminishing returns because they don't work that well together. Like Steam Vents Sulfur Falls is a fine keep in your opening hand, but Sulfur Falls is not. Similarly, there are these Desolate Lighthouses, and like even Mountain with Sulfur Falls can mess you up a little bit. So I'm fine with 3 Steam Vents, 3 Sulfur Falls. I think that the deck likely needs more red sources than just like cutting Steam Vents for an island, say, but I feel like yeah, the Steam Vents is probably reasonable in this deck. It could also be a Cascade Bluffs, could be some amount of Spire Bluff Canals, but that card is pretty poor with Cryptic Command and Through the Breach because you want your lands to ETB untapped on turn 4, turn 5. So not Spire Bluff Canals. Cascade Bluffs would work pretty well against aggressive matchups where you want to aggressively fetch mountains so you're not taking a lot of damage. And then you want to have Cryptic Command open on turn 4 when you also draw a Desolate Lighthouse. Like Cascade Bluffs fixes for that, but it's also pretty awkward with Lighthouse just in general, and kind of awkward when you have a bunch of like 1 mana spells, which this deck does have too. So yeah, I think I like the way this main deck is constructed. 3 Snapcaster Mage might be kind of odd, but again, this is not like super heavy grindy deck, nor is it necessarily trying to kill you with Snapcaster Bolt, so I think 3 is a pretty reasonable number. Yeah, I have like no issues with this main deck whatsoever. I really like the way that it is constructed, and it is noteworthy that the person who got third in this PTQ 9-0'd the Swiss eventually lost to Dredge, and when we look at the sideboard, there's not a lot for Dredge here. That's kind of a problem. There are a couple Engineered Explosives, which is just generic catch-all. Biforce for Affinity, which is nice, especially if you don't want to go through the trouble of splashing Ancient Grudge. Also have a Vandal Blast, which you can flashback with Snapcaster Mage, but you can't Snapcaster Overload it, which is not necessarily a big deal, but that was a thing that we were doing with Jace Vryn's Prodigy for a little bit, so I wanted to just be clear that you cannot do that. You can Snapcaster a Biforce, which is nice. Copy of Jace, which is a card that started showing up in a lot of Splinter Twin decks towards the end of its run, and I kind of like it. It's just like this mid-rangey, card advantage-y thing that kind of helps. This is similar to like boarding in an additional threat against Thoughtseize decks, because Jace is going to provide you with like basically 2 card draws. If you're like under pressure, you know, like if they let it sit around, obviously it can do much more than that, but presumably you're just like Jace minus. A couple Anger of the Gods, which help against Dredge, but aren't really enough. These are more so for like tribal go wide decks. A couple of copies of Roast for Tasker, Gurmag, Angler, and Eldrazi, which I like a lot. Shadow of Doubt is a card that I think these blue decks kind of have to utilize to beat the Primeval Titan decks, but there are enough counterspells with the Cryptic Commands that I think that 1 copy of Shadow of Doubt is fine, and you don't necessarily need the additional copies because you already have like hard counterspells. Now, if they start playing like Cavern of Souls or something, then obviously that's a whole different situation. A couple Ceremonious Projections for mostly Eldrazi Tron. Obviously, there are still some Tron decks out there. And then we have a bunch of Dispels, which is, hey, I want to win these blue mirrors. I want to be able to force through the breaches, because that is basically the only way I'm going to be able to kill you. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure how many of these I would want against Grixis Death Shadow, but seeing as how that is the primary blue deck in the format, I would assume that they want all 3 copies there. But who knows? Who knows? We're going to play some games. We're going to have some people. We're going to have a lot of fun. And hope you all enjoy.